The rain fell hard against the windows of the small diner in Portland, Oregon. The soft clinking of silverware, the low murmur of conversations, and the steady hiss of the coffee machine blended with the rhythmic patter of raindrops. The air inside smelled of brewed coffee and freshly baked muffins, warm and familiar, almost comforting. If only her life felt the same. Isabel Harper wiped down the counter with slow, practiced movements. Her hands moved, but her mind was elsewhere, buried under the weight of unpaid bills, a car that hadn't started in 2 weeks, and the gnawing fear that maybe this was all her life would ever be. At 34, she had grown used to struggle, but the weariness in her bones was new. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was a quiet surrender she fought to ignore every day. "Hey, Izzy, you can clock out. I'll close tonight," her coworker Mark called from the kitchen, his voice muffled behind the swinging doors. "Thanks," she replied softly, forcing a tired smile. "Just taking out the trash first." She slipped on her rain jacket, now faded and frayed at the sleeves, grabbed the heavy bags, and pushed open the back door. The cold air bit her cheeks, and the scent of wet asphalt and distant pine trees hit her all at once. It was the kind of night where people rushed to their warm homes. But Isabel had nowhere to rush. She stepped into the alley behind the diner, the bag swinging at her side, when something stopped her mid-step. A child, alone, sitting in a wheelchair under the rain, drenched and trembling. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His blonde hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, wide, unsure, full of fear, met hers. Isabel's heart clenched. "Hey," she whispered, dropping the bags and kneeling beside him. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't answer at first. His lips quivered, his fingers gripping the cold metal of the armrests. I don't know. I got lost." Isabel didn't hesitate. She didn't ask herself what time it was, or what kind of risk she might be taking. All she saw was a child, vulnerable and alone. "Let's get you out of this rain," she said gently. "Come on, I'll make you a hot chocolate." As she pushed the boy's wheelchair toward the back door, neither of them noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. Inside, behind tinted windows, a man watched silently. Would you like to know what happened next? If this story touched your heart, give a like and leave a comment with your name and city. We'd love to send you a special shout out in the next video. And if you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, subscribe now and join our growing community of people who know that small acts can change everything. The warmth of the diner hit them like a wave. The bell above the back door chimed softly as Isabel wheeled the boy inside. The fluorescent lights cast a gentle glow across the empty tables. Most customers were gone for the night, just a few regulars lingering over late-night pie and coffee. Isabel grabbed a clean towel from behind the counter and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. His skin was icy to the touch. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked, kneeling beside him once again. "Ethan," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain outside. "Okay, Ethan, I'm Isabel. You're safe now." She guided him to a booth near the heater and grabbed a blanket from the staff closet. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and a drizzle of caramel. Ethan's small hands trembled as he took the mug. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, sitting across from him. "You're not from around here, are you?" He shook his head. "I was with my dad. We stopped for gas and I don't know what happened." Isabel's eyes softened. Something in her chest tightened, not just pity, but a recognition of that lost look. She knew what it was like to feel forgotten. But as she gently wiped the rain from Ethan's forehead, she didn't notice the tall figure that had stepped into the shadows outside the window. In the black SUV across the street, Michael Grant, CEO of Grant Technologies and one of the most powerful men on the West Coast, watched the scene unfold. His face was unreadable, but his eyes followed every move Isabel made. Ethan was his son. Michael's driver, seated beside him, cleared his throat. "Sir, do you want to step in?" Michael didn't respond right away. He watched as Ethan smiled for the first time in weeks, sipping the hot chocolate with whipped cream on his nose. "She's not like the others," Michael finally said. "Do you want to approach her?" the driver asked. "No, not yet." He turned his eyes back to Isabel, this woman who had no idea who the boy really was or who she was comforting. He wanted to know who she was. He needed to know why someone like her, just a waitress, a stranger, could reach his son in a way no one else had. What Michael would discover in the days to come would change everything. The clock on the diner wall ticked past midnight, but Isabel didn't notice. She sat with Ethan, watching as his small frame finally began to relax. The color returned to his cheeks, and the fear in his eyes softened into something gentler, something that resembled safety. He had barely spoken more than a few words, but Isabel didn't push him. She knew what it was like to need silence more than questions. "You know," she said, smiling gently, "I used to get lost when I was little. Not in the city, though. In the woods behind my grandmother's house." Ethan looked up from his mug, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "She had this big oak tree that looked like it touched the sky," Isabel continued. "One day, I wandered too far. Got turned around. I was scared, just like you probably were. But someone found me. A neighbor. He didn't yell or ask questions. Just walked beside me until I was home." Ethan sipped his hot chocolate. "Were you okay?" "I was, because someone decided to care." The words hung in the air like a quiet promise. From across the street, Michael Grant sat in the back seat of his SUV, still watching. He had told himself he would only observe tonight. No interference, no explanations. But something about Isabel's calmness, her presence, it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Not since his wife died. Not since he began burying grief beneath contracts and boardrooms. Ethan had barely smiled in months. And now, he looked peaceful, warm, present. Michael reached for his phone. "Wesley," he said to his assistant on the other end, "find out everything you can about that woman." There was a pause. "Yes, sir. Any specific reason?" "She's different." Michael stared through the window as Isabel gently tucked the blanket tighter around Ethan's shoulders. The boy let out a content sigh. "She doesn't see him as a burden," Michael added quietly. "She sees him as a child." Back inside the diner, Isabel cleaned up the empty mug, and Ethan yawned, leaning against the booth cushion. "Do you have somewhere to go, Ethan?" He hesitated. "My dad was at the gas station, but I don't know where he went." Isabel's heart squeezed. She reached for her phone. "We'll figure out. First thing in the morning, we'll call the police and make sure you get home safe." "Deal." He nodded slowly. "Okay." She gave him one last smile before turning out the lights. "You can sleep here for now. I'll be right in the back." What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the man she'd unknowingly helped that night was about to walk into her life. But would his arrival bring gratitude or consequences? Morning broke over Portland with gray skies and the smell of damp earth. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the city slick and quiet, like it was still catching its breath. Isabel arrived early at the diner, her coat damp from the mist in the air, her hair pulled back in a low, hurried bun. But something felt different. She had barely stepped inside when she noticed Ethan still sleeping in the corner booth, wrapped in the same blanket from the night before. A soft snore escaped his lips, and for a moment, Isabel allowed herself to smile. Despite the chaos of her own life, this small moment, watching him rest peacefully, felt like something close to purpose. She was just beginning to prepare a simple breakfast when the front door opened and a gust of cold air rushed in. A tall man in a black coat stepped inside. The entire diner seemed to pause. Isabel turned, wiping her hands on her apron. She recognized him immediately, not because she knew him, but because he didn't belong. His presence was magnetic, controlled. His shoes were polished, his posture too perfect. He wasn't from around here, not from this world. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice guarded. The man stepped forward, removing his leather gloves with deliberate calm. "Isabel Harper?" She froze. "Yes, that's me." He nodded. "My name is Michael Grant." The name hit her like a slow wave. She'd heard it before, on the news, in articles about tech empires and billion-dollar mergers. Grant Technologies. That was him. "I believe you spent some time with my son last night," he continued, his voice low but composed. Isabel's heart skipped. She instinctively looked toward the booth where Ethan was still curled up. "Your son, Ethan?" Michael gave the faintest smile. "Yes. He wandered off while we were on the road. I've been looking for him for hours." There was no relief in his voice. No panic, just control. "I didn't know," Isabel said. "He was alone, in the rain. I couldn't just leave him." "I know," Michael replied. "That's why I'm here." He took a seat at the counter, motioning for her to join him. Reluctantly, Isabel sat down. "If you're here to accuse me of anything—" "I'm not," he interrupted. "Quite the opposite, actually." She looked at him, unsure. Michael studied her face for a long moment. "I watched you, last night, from my car. I saw the way you treated him. You weren't afraid. You weren't pitying. You just saw him." Isabel shifted in her seat. "He's a kid. He needed help. Anyone would have done the same." Michael shook his head. "No, not anyone. Not most. You were kind without knowing who he was. Without knowing who I was." She folded her arms. "What do you want from me?" He reached into his coat and placed a card on the counter. "I'd like you to come to my office tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. I have a proposition." She blinked. "A job interview?" "Something like that," he replied. "You help my son. I want to understand who you are." "I'm just a waitress," she said. "You've got assistants, advisors, a whole team. What could I possibly offer you?" Michael stood. "That's what I want to find out." He looked at her once more, then at Ethan, who was now beginning to stir. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Isabel staring at the card in her hand. She read it twice. "Michael Grant, CEO, Grant Technologies, Tower 47, downtown Portland." Her fingers tightened around it. That night, as the diner emptied and the neon sign buzzed softly against a window, Isabel sat alone in the same booth where Ethan had slept. She turned the card over and over between her fingers. Was this real? Was it a test? A trap? She thought about her bills, her broken car, the hollow feeling of always being stuck in the same place while the rest of the world moved on. Maybe this was a chance. Or maybe it was just one more disappointment dressed up as opportunity. Her thoughts were interrupted when Ethan walked up beside her, blankets still draped around his shoulders. "Are you okay?" he asked. She looked at him and smiled. "I'm not sure yet, but maybe I will be." But what waited for her behind the doors of Grand Technologies would challenge everything she thought she knew about kindness, power, and herself. If this story is moving you, leave a like and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what part has touched you the most so far? We'd love to give you a shout out in the next episode. Let's keep building a community of people who believe that empathy can change lives. The following morning, the streets of downtown Portland were already alive with movement. Cars honked in the distance. Heels clicked on wet sidewalks, and steam rose from coffee carts on every corner. Isabel stood in front of the towering glass structure of Grand Technologies, feeling like a misplaced puzzle piece. Her coat was modest, her shoes worn, and her nerves barely contained beneath the surface of her carefully controlled expression. Around her, men and women in designer suits moved with confident strides, earpieces in place, briefcases in hand. She held a simple card in her fingers like it was a ticket to a world she had no map for. Inside the lobby, everything gleamed, marble floors. A front desk carved from what looked like Italian stone. Monitors flickering with graphs and news tickers. She felt as if she had stepped into another universe. "May I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice polite but clipped, already scanning Isabel from head to toe. I have an appointment with Michael Grant," Isabel replied, showing the card. For a second, the receptionist hesitated, her eyebrows slightly raised. But then she typed quickly into her screen. "Mr. Grant is expecting you. Floor 47. The elevator is to your right." Isabel stepped inside the elevator, her heart racing as each floor number lit up. It wasn't fear. It was the overwhelming weight of not knowing what was waiting at the top. When the doors opened, a man in a fitted gray suit stood waiting. "Ms. Harper?" he asked. "I'm Wesley." Mr. Grant's assistant. Please follow me. They walked through a sleek hallway with glass walls and offices too quiet to be real. Everyone she passed glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. She didn't belong here, and they all knew it. Finally, Wesley opened a large door, revealing a minimalist office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Michael Grant stood behind a dark wooden desk, his back to her, staring out at Portland like it was a chessboard he had mastered long ago. "Thank you, Wesley," he said without turning. The door closed. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. Then Michael turned around, his expression unreadable. "You came." Isabel gave a small nod. "I almost didn't. I figured." He motioned for her to sit. "But you did, which means you're at least a little curious." She sat on the edge of the leather chair, tense. "So why am I here?" Michael leaned forward. "Because you did something no one else has done in a long time. You connected with Ethan. I didn't do anything special. You did exactly what others failed to do, including me," he said quietly. "You saw him." Isabel exhaled, unsure what to say. "I want to offer you a job," Michael continued. "Not as a nanny, not as an assistant, as something in between. In between, I need someone Ethan trusts. Someone grounded. Someone outside this world." She stared at him. "I'm not qualified for anything in this building. I serve coffee. I mop floors. I can't even fix my own car." Michael's expression softened slightly. "You have the one qualification I can't find on a resume. Heart." Before she could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. Wesley peeked in. "Sir, the board meeting begins in 10 minutes. "I'll be right there," Michael said. Then he turned to Isabel. "Come in tomorrow. Shadow me. Meet Ethan again. If you still think this isn't for you, no hard feelings." He stood. "But I think this could be something more than just a job." Isabel rose, trying to steady her voice. "And if I say yes, then we'll figure out the rest as we go." She left the office in a daze. The hallway outside felt colder, sharper. As she passed two employees near the elevators, she heard them whisper, "She's the one. The waitress. This won't last a week." Isabel pretended not to hear, but the sting was real. What she didn't know was that behind polished doors and corporate smiles, not everyone wanted her there, and someone was already working to push her out. The next morning, Isabel stood once again in front of the towering glass building of Grand Technologies, this time wearing her best outfit. Still modest, still simple, but clean and pressed with care. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her jacket. She had barely slept, replaying Michael's words in her head over and over. This could be something more than just a job. Inside, Wesley greeted her with a nod, offering no smile but at least no judgment. He led her through the halls like a ghost in a world of suits and high-stakes meetings. Ethan was waiting in a private room, designed more like a luxury living space than an office. A wall of books, soft lighting, a sensory area filled with puzzles, art supplies, and quiet toys. He looked up when Isabel entered and smiled. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she replied, kneeling beside him. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," he said. "It's not raining." She chuckled. "That helps." Michael entered a moment later, phone in hand, jacket already off. "I've got 3 meetings back to back. Ethan, you're with Isabel today. I'll check in at lunch." Ethan nodded without hesitation. Isabel noticed the way his eyes followed Michael, still distant, still unsure. As the morning unfolded, Isabel worked alongside Ethan on a simple art project. He showed her a drawing of a tree with uneven branches, each one holding a different colored leaf. "That one's you," he said, pointing to a bright orange leaf. "Why orange?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's warm," he replied, "and it makes the tree feel alive." Isabel blinked back a wave of emotion. No one had ever described her that way before. Outside the room, however, the atmosphere was not nearly as gentle. Some employees stared when she walked by, others whispered. A few ignored her completely, even when she politely greeted them. She overheard one conversation in the break room that stopped her cold. Michael's always chasing some emotional redemption arc, a woman scoffed. Now it's the waitress's turn to be his latest project. She won't last a week, another added. That sting returned, the same sting she had felt all her life. Not enough. Not good enough. Not worthy. During lunch, Michael returned, briefcase in one hand, sandwich in the other. "How's it going?" he asked casually, glancing between her and Ethan. "We're doing okay," Isabel said, managing a smile. Michael sat on the edge of the desk, biting into a sandwich. "You settling in?" She hesitated, trying to. "Give it time," he said. "It's not the people I brought in from the outside who usually fail here. It's the ones who can't remember how to feel." His phone buzzed. He sighed and stood. "I'll see you later this afternoon." But just as he walked out, Isabel noticed something strange. A young intern approached Ethan's table while Michael's back was turned. The intern, maybe 19 or 20, smiled at Ethan and casually took one of his puzzle pieces. "Can I borrow this, buddy?" Ethan froze. His hand hovered over the table, eyes wide with uncertainty. Isabel stepped in without hesitation. "Actually, he's using that right now." The intern looked up, clearly surprised. "Oh, I didn't realize." "He's not a prop. He's a person," Isabel said firmly. "You ask. You don't just take." The intern flushed. "Sorry, I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," she replied. "But now you do." He nodded and backed away. Ethan looked at her quietly. "Thanks." "No one touches your tree without asking," she said with a wink. It wasn't a big moment, but it was everything. Later that day, as Isabel walked past the executive lounge, she overheard another conversation. This time it was about her. She defended the kid, someone said, in front of an intern. "She has no idea how things work around here." "She doesn't need to," a voice replied. "She's exactly what he needs." She didn't recognize that voice. But for the first time, she didn't care who did or didn't like her. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here for Ethan, and maybe for herself too. But what Isabel didn't know was that her kindness had just put a target on her back. If you believe in the power of kindness in a world that often forgets it, leave a like to show your support. Subscribe and be part of a community that values stories that heal and uplift. This channel doesn't make profit. It's built on passion. Your like and subscription make all the difference. Yellowheart. The following week passed in a blur. Isabel fell into a routine she hadn't known she needed, arriving early, spending mornings with Ethan, helping him with his therapy exercises, learning the silent language of his trust. The boy who once trembled in the rain was now laughing softly at her bad jokes and showing her how to fold paper airplanes. She never thought she'd feel peace in a corporate tower. But peace, it seemed, had a short shelf life. It started with whispers. Then came the glances. And finally, one morning, when she arrived, the security guard didn't smile. "Mr. Grant wants to see you in his office," he said, avoiding eye contact. Her chest tightened. "Is something wrong?" "I don't know. Just he asked for you." The elevator ride felt longer than ever. Her reflection in the mirrored walls stared back at her with fear she couldn't shake. What could it be? Was Ethan okay? Had she made a mistake? When the doors opened, Wesley was already waiting. "Right this way." He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how she was. Inside Michael's office, the energy had shifted. The lights were dimmer, the air heavier. Michael stood by the window, arms crossed. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice distant. Isabel stepped in slowly. "What happened?" Michael turned to face her and slid a folder across his desk. Inside were printed email screenshots, confidential reports, and a timestamp. "All of this was leaked to the press last night," he said, "from a device that accessed our internal server." She blinked. "I don't understand." "The device was traced back to the guest account you used last Thursday." Isabel stared at him, her pulse thudding in her ears. "You think I did this?" Michael didn't speak. His silence spoke louder. "I would never," she stammered, voice cracking. "Why would I do something like that? I don't even understand half the things in those reports." "It's not about understanding," he said coldly. "It's about access." "I helped your son," she cried. "I've been here every day, showing up, doing everything I can." Michael's jaw tightened. "I'm not accusing you, Isabel. I'm giving you a chance to explain." Her chest rose and fell with fast, shallow breaths. "There's nothing to explain. Someone used that computer after me. Someone set me up." Michael sat slowly. "If that's true, I'll find out. But until then," she asked, voice hollow, "what happened to me?" There was a long pause. "You'll remain on leave until the investigation is complete." Just like that, she was out. No warning, no kindness, no trust. As she turned to leave, her hands trembling, she looked back once. "You said I was the only one who saw him," she said. "But maybe you never saw me." That night, Isabel sat on the edge of her twin bed in her small apartment, still wearing the same clothes she'd left the office in. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't even cried. She just existed. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Ethan's tablet. A drawing. A stick figure with orange leaves. She broke. Tears ran down her cheeks, and her breath hitched in her throat. They were wrong about her. But who would believe her? And then, like a thread being pulled from memory, she remembered something. A man, weeks ago, at the diner, friendly, too friendly, asking questions about Grant Technologies, about Michael, about access. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it all felt too deliberate. She may have lost everything, but she wasn't leaving without the truth. 2 days had passed. Isabel hadn't heard from Michael, or Ethan. The silence cut deeper than the accusation. Every time her phone lit up, her heart leapt, only to crash again when it was just a spam call or a bill reminder. She was invisible again. Except now, she'd tasted what it felt like to be seen. That thought alone kept her breathing. She couldn't go back to pretending she didn't care. Not after everything. Not after Ethan. So, on the third morning, she pulled on her coat, tied her hair back, and walked into the same diner where it had all begun. The coffee smelled the same. The old neon lights buzzed. And at table 6, her favorite, she sat with a cup of black coffee, memories flooding her chest. And then she remembered him, the man with the navy jacket. He had come in just before closing, ordered nothing, asked too many questions. At the time, it seemed like curiosity. Now it felt like something else. She took a breath and pulled out a napkin. She drew what she could recall: his short hair, square jaw, the way he kept checking his phone. Then she went to the register and asked Lou, the cook, "Hey, do you remember a guy who came a few weeks ago? Right before close. He didn't eat. Asked a lot about Michael Grant and the company." Lou raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I remember. Weird dude. Said he worked in supply chain, but he didn't know the name of our food distributor. Wrote his name in the guest book." Isabel blinked. "Guest book?" Lou pointed behind the counter. A thick spiral-bound notebook sat there, half filled with doodles, names, and notes. She flipped through the pages, heart racing, until she saw it. Antonio Marquez, consultant. Her fingers froze on the name. She took a picture of the page. It wasn't much, but it was something. That afternoon, Isabel sat in front of a local print and copy center's public computer. She ran the name through every search engine she could find. Most results were generic. A few were promising. And one, just one, matched her gut feeling. Antonio Marquez, freelance tech consultant, known for advising small firms before mergers. Allegedly connected to 2 prior data leaks, though never formally charged. There it was, the thread. She grabbed her phone and dialed the only number she still had that could possibly lead to Michael. Wesley answered. "Isabel, I need to speak to him. He's not available. It's about the leak." Silence. "I'm serious, Wesley. I have a name. I have a photo. And I have a trail. If he doesn't want to listen to me, fine. But I'm taking this to the press. I have nothing to lose." Another pause. Then, "Be at the building in an hour." Michael didn't say anything when she walked into his office. His face was unreadable. the pain in his eyes carefully buried beneath layers of professionalism. "I shouldn't have come back," Isabel said, "but I need you to see this." She slid her phone across the desk and showed him the image. "Antonio Marquez," she said. "He was at the diner, weeks before any of this happened, pretending to be someone he wasn't, and he has a history." Michael leaned forward, brows furrowing. "I think he used the guest terminal I logged into. I think I was set up." He studied the photo for a long time, then looked up. "Why didn't you just walk away?" "Because Ethan smiled at me," she said, "and I don't get many things in life that feel right." "He did." Michael leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since the accusation, his voice softened. "I'll have my legal team follow the lead. If you're right." "I am," she said firmly. "And if you're wrong?" he asked, testing. She held his gaze. "Then I'll apologize, but I won't regret trying." That night, as she walked home in the cold evening air, Isabel felt something new. Not hope, not yet, but traction. Like the wheels of her life had finally found a grip again. But the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous the silence around it became. The next few days passed in slow motion. Michael didn't call. Wesley didn't text. No news came. Isabel went to work at the diner, poured coffee, wiped tables, and tried to live like the world hadn't cracked open under her feet. But she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. Had they followed up? Had they believed her? Had it even mattered? She didn't want praise. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted someone to say, "I'm sorry, we were wrong." Then, on a cloudy Thursday morning, a black car pulled up in front of the diner. She saw it through the window. The same car, the same driver. Wesley stepped out and walked straight toward her. This time, there was no coldness in his eyes, no distance. "Isabel," he said, "Michael needs to see you. Now." The moment she stepped into Michael's office, she knew something had changed. He stood at the window again, but his posture was different. Heavy, human. "There's been a development," he said without turning around. "I guessed," she replied softly. "We traced the breach to a private email server created by Antonio Marquez. He used your credentials, the same ones he watched you type when you logged into the diner's computer." She took a slow breath. Michael turned to face her. "You were right." Isabel nodded, but her expression didn't change. "I know." He studied her. "Why are you not angry?" She hesitated. "I was, but I burned through it." A long pause followed. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry." She swallowed. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe one to Ethan." Michael flinched at that. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "Then start by listening," she said, "to your son, to the people you dismiss, to the ones who see the world through different eyes." He offered her job back, but Isabel shook her head. "I didn't come for the job," she said. "I came for the truth." Michael nodded slowly. "What do you want, then?" She paused. "To leave with dignity," she said. "To know I wasn't crazy, that I mattered, even for a moment." He stepped closer, then placed something in her hand. A folded drawing, Ethan's tree, the orange leaf still there. "He wanted you to have it," Michael said. She looked down at it, her fingers tracing the uneven lines. And for the first time in days, she smiled. "I'd like to say goodbye to him," she whispered. That afternoon, Isabel found Ethan sitting on the same window bench where they used to work on puzzles. He looked up and saw her, really saw her, and ran into her arms without hesitation. "I missed you," he said into her shoulder. "I missed you too," she whispered. "But you're going to be okay." "You're not coming back?" She shook her head. "But I'll never forget you." He pulled something from his pocket, a small puzzle piece. "For you," he said. She held it like it was made of gold. "Keep building your tree," she told him. "You'll know where the orange leaf goes." Outside the building, the wind picked up. The clouds parted just enough to let light spill over the streets of Portland. She walked slowly, puzzle piece in hand, not toward the past, but into whatever future was waiting next. And while she left the building behind, the strength she found inside it would stay with her forever. Isabel sat alone on a park bench in Forest Park, the vast green stretching out around her, early spring light brushing the tops of the trees. Children's laughter echoed in the distance, and the scent of damp earth and cherry blossoms filled the air. In her hand, she still held the puzzle piece Ethan had given her. It was smooth and small, insignificant to anyone else. But to her, it was a symbol of everything she had fought for. A life that had once been quiet, ordinary, overlooked, now marked by courage and grace. She had not left that building victorious in the eyes of the world. There were no headlines, no standing ovations. But inside, something had changed. She had spoken the truth. She had stood her ground, and she had left without bitterness in her heart. For the first time in a long time, she had chosen herself. A breeze passed, lifting strands of her hair as she tilted her head back to feel the warmth of the sun. Her life wasn't perfect. There were still bills to pay, still late shifts and tired feet. But she had a strength now that no one could take away. Not Michael, not the whispers in the hallway, not the system that had tried to break her. Just then, her phone buzzed. A new message. It was a photo. Ethan, holding a new drawing. A bigger tree, more branches, and on the top right, a new orange leaf. Her eyes welled, not with pain, but with quiet joy. He remembered. She had left something behind, not just in a room or a role, but in someone's heart, and that was more than enough. She stood up, brushing the bench slats from her coat, and walked forward, not fast, not with a plan, but with purpose. Because sometimes the greatest reward isn't the job you win or the apology you get. Sometimes it's the peace you carry after finally realizing your worth. And Isabel, she was just getting started. It had been 3 weeks since Isabel walked away from Grant Technologies. Life had returned to something resembling normal. Her shifts at the diner were back. The coffee tasted the same, and her small apartment still smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. But she was different. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. And apparently, she wasn't the only one who noticed. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, as she wiped down table 4 for the second time, the bell above the diner door chimed. She looked up, expecting a regular, but it was Wesley, still in his perfectly tailored blazer. But he wasn't the same either. He looked around, as if trying to see the place through her eyes. His expression was uncertain, almost vulnerable. "You came all this way?" she asked, half teasing. He offered a tight smile. "Let's just say, I've had some time to think." She led him to a corner booth, poured him a coffee, and sat across from him, folding her arms on the table. "I wanted to apologize," he said after a moment. "Not for the accusation. We were following protocol. But for how I saw you." She tilted her head. "You weren't just a waitress," he continued. "You were the only one in that building who didn't want anything from anyone. I just wanted to help a kid," she said. Wesley looked down at his coffee, then back up. "You did more than that. You helped change the temperature of an entire company." She raised an eyebrow. "We started a new program," he explained. "Michael's calling it the Orange Leaf Initiative. Internal mentorship, empathy training, disability support. It's early, but people are talking. And for once, not about stock prices." She blinked. "You left," he said, "but your presence stayed. Ethan still asks about you." Isabel smiled softly, emotions rising like a quiet tide. "I'm not here to convince you to come back," Wesley said. "I think what you did was rare, and I think it was enough." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping coffee. Then Isabel asked, "Why did you change?" He hesitated. "Because I realize that people like you, they make the rest of us look in the mirror. And sometimes we don't like what we see." Later that evening, as Isabel walked home, she passed a small bookstore she had always admired but never entered. Something pulled her inside. The woman behind the counter, an older woman with bright eyes, smiled warmly. "You look like someone who's just finished one story," she said, "but hasn't quite started the next." Isabel chuckled. "That obvious, huh?" The woman nodded and handed her a journal. "Write it down, even the hard parts, especially those." Isabel turned the journal over in her hands. Soft leather, blank pages. She bought it without hesitation. That night, Back in her apartment, Isabel lit a candle, made a cup of tea, and opened the journal to the first page. She wrote, "The world didn't fall apart. I did, but then I built myself again, and that changed everything." The echo of her kindness still rang in corporate hallways, in Ethan's drawings, in Wesley's coffee cup, in her own steady breath. And sometimes, echoes are louder than thunder, but one final moment still waited for her, a chance she never expected, a letter that would change everything. Again, the letter arrived on a Thursday. No return address, just her name, written in neat handwriting across a pale blue envelope. It was tucked between electricity bills and grocery ads. So ordinary, it almost went unnoticed. Isabel held it in her hands, heart beating slow but loud. She opened it with care. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper, and a note. "You left quietly, but not without a trace. We're opening something new, something that needs someone like you. If you're willing, let this be your invitation. No expectations, just possibility. M." She read it 3 times, then folded it gently and placed it on her kitchen table, next to her journal. She didn't move for a while, just stared at the flickering candle and let the silence wrap around her like a warm coat. She hadn't been looking for a second chance, but maybe one had found her anyway. 3 weeks later, Isabel stood inside a small building in the outskirts of Portland, a refurbished community center being transformed into a new kind of place. Part support hub, part after-school program, part quiet space for people who didn't fit anywhere else. She was there not as a guest, but as part of something being built. Together, Ethan was there, too, once a week, drawing trees on whiteboards and laughing with a boy who rarely spoke, but now couldn't stop. Michael visited sometimes, not as a CEO, but as a father. He brought coffee and notebooks and never tried to take over. Wesley volunteered to teach workshops on digital safety. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. And Isabel, she listened, she smiled, she walked quietly among the chaos, creating calm. She still worked part-time at the diner, still lived in the same apartment, but the world around her had changed. Or maybe she had finally learned to see the world differently. One evening, after everyone had left, she sat by the window of the center's small library. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of coral and lavender. In her lap, the journal rested, now halfway full. She turned to a blank page, wrote slowly, "This is not the end of my story. It's the beginning of everything. And for the first time in my life, I believe I belong." She closed the book, looked out the window, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had chosen herself again and again until the world caught up. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Have you ever been overlooked and proved them wrong? What was your moment of comeback? Your small, quiet revolution? Let's share our voices and build a community where every story matters. If you believe in second chances, in dignity, in quiet strength, subscribe to our channel and be part of something bigger. We don't make videos for fame. We make them for hearts like yours. And don't forget to like and share this story with someone who needs it today. You might just change someone's path the way Isabel changed hers.